What's up, everybody? I'm Farhad from Epitech Academy. Welcome to the second video in our series, helping you master loops. Today we're going to talk about while loops and do while loops. Maybe you've never used these before, and if you have, do you know when you would use these kinds of loops over some other loops, such as a for loop? For example, if I ask you to create a application emulating rolling a dice until you land on 6, would you use a for loop, a while loop, or a do while loop? If you're not sure, stay tuned. We'll also cover some real-world applications for these kinds of loops. Let's get to it. All right, I'm already in IntelliJ. Fair warning, I have a bit of COVID running through my system right now, so if my voice sounds a little bit off, my apologies. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so I'm going to create a new project here. Let's call this while and do while loops. Oops, there's an extra O there. Create. And let's make our screen a little bit bigger, close that out. Okay, before we get into why we even use while loops, let's take a look at the basic syntax and what that looks like and how a while loop works. So we'll start off creating a while loop. We start with the keyword while, followed by a condition that sits in these parentheses, and then a set of curly braces. In our condition, let's start off with an integer. Actually, let's just say true. So we won't remember that when we use a condition, whether it's no matter what the condition is, it needs to be something that can evaluate into a true or false value. So we could just write true, right? And then over here, we'll print out, this will print forever. Okay, so here's how the while loop works. This is very simple. A while loop checks this condition that's in the parentheses, and as long as that condition is true, whatever is in between these curly braces will just continue to run. Now, true, of course, is always true. This is never going to be false. So this will actually create an infinite loop. Let's get rid of that print line up above and make this a little bit more concise. There we go. All right, let's run this. And this is going to continue printing. I'm going to stop it immediately. But look how many times we got this print line. It actually just keeps going on, right? That's probably like several thousands of lines by now. Okay, so let's turn this into something that isn't an infinite loop. So we'll start off with some int value. We'll say int num equals 1. And let's change our condition to say while num is less than or equal to 10, continue printing, not this will print forever. Let's say easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Of course, if we leave this as is and then run it again, this will still be an infinite loop, right? Because we're starting with int num being equal to 1, and then we're saying as long as num, which is 1, as long as that is less than or equal to 10, continue running this, right? But because we're never changing the value of num, this is just going to print on forever. So we need another line in here that eventually will be set up so that this expression will be false eventually, right? So here we'll say num plus plus. So this will increment the value of num in each iteration of this while loop. Now if we run this, we should see this line, easy peasy lemon squeezy, be printed out about 10 times, right? And if we want to really be sure how many times it's being printed, let's actually include the print of the word num, or of the variable num. Plus, and we'll say colon, easy peasy lemon squeezy. Let's try that again. Great, now we can see that it has been printed 10 times. So this is how a while loop works. This should be pretty straightforward. Now that you're familiar with how a while loop looks and how it functions, let's give you a quick task. I want you to try this out and then pause the video, and try it out, and then come back once you've solved it. So here's your task. Create a while loop that prints numbers 10 to 20. Okay, pause the video here, and let's see if you can solve it on your own, and then unpause and come back. All right, hopefully that wasn't too challenging. We'll say int, I'm going to call this num2 since we already have a variable num on line 4. Int num2 equals, and we'll say 10, and our while loop will say while num2 is less than or equal to 20, and this will just do a print line for num2. And of course, we need the essential step of incrementing num2 in each iteration, otherwise we'll have an infinite loop. So we'll say num2 plus plus. Let's also comment out the previous code so we don't see those additional lines in our console. Cool, so there's our print for numbers 10 to 20. What if we wanted to print down from 20 to 10? How would you handle that? Pause the video here and see if you can solve that on your own. All right, here's how you would actually handle that. So we'll start off and we'll have int num3 equals 20. And here we'll say while num3 is greater than or equal to 10, print num2, or rather num3. And then instead of saying num3 plus plus, here we'll say num3 minus minus, because we're starting at 20 and we want this to decrease down to 10. So we'll use minus minus to decrement the value of num3 in each iteration of this while loop. All right, let's comment out the previous code again, so we don't see that in our console. And let's run this again. We should see a print from 20 down to 10. There it is, 20 down to 10. Cool. Okay, so now you know how a while loop works, what the syntax looks like. Let's go over a real-world scenario of when you would use a while loop. Here, we'll use Scanner to take user input and try to get a user to verify a password. Let's again comment out the previous code. And we'll say scanner equals new scanner system.in. If you're not familiar with Scanner, that's okay. Scanner is used to get user input through the console. It's a great way to mock out what a front end would look like without actually having to build out a front end. So this will allow us to take user input from a console. So here's what we'll do. We'll have Scanner taking user input from the console, and we'll have a string password, which is the correct password. In fact, let's call it correct password, equals you'll never guess me. All right. And we'll have a string to represent the user's input. So we'll say string user inputs, and we'll initialize it as an empty string. And here's what we want the while loop to do. We'll say as long as it's the case that the user input is not equal to the correct password, we want the user to just continuously be asked for the password. Here's how we can handle that. So we'll say while not, remember that the exclamation mark in a logical expression stands for not, right? So here we'll say while it's the case that not user input dot equals correct password. So as long as it's the case that the user input is not equal to correct password, right? Because we have this not. then we want to continuously ask the user for the password. So we'll say here, enter your password. And then user input equals scanner.next. Okay, so what's happening on line 35? If you're not familiar with Scanner, this is just being used to take whatever the user enters on the next line of the console, and then it assigns that value to the user input. Okay, let's see how this works in practice. So let's run this. Okay, so we have Scanner set up on line 29, and then we have our string correct password, you'll never guess me. User input is an empty string. And then we say, while the user input is not equal to the correct password, perform these tasks, right? So here we're saying, enter your password, and that's what we're seeing here. Now, whenever I enter on this next line, by saying scanner.next, or by saying user input equals scanner.next, that's going to take whatever I write and assign that to the value of user input. So if I say foobar, and click enter, foobar is going to be assigned as the value to user input. And then that's the end of that block, right? So again, it'll check the condition inside of the while loop. It'll check whether it's the case that user input, which is foobar, is it true that that's not equal to the correct password, right? And since that is the case, it's going to ask me this question again to enter my password. Let's try it out. I'm going to click enter, and there it is, right? So I get that feedback again, enter your password. And let's say incorrect password, right? So again, I get that feedback. All right. I'm knocking stuff down. I got a little bit too excited. All right. So let's enter the correct password. We'll say, you'll never guess me. Enter. And that's where the application ends, right? So that's great. Okay, but it would be nice to get some kind of feedback letting the user know that they did get the correct password and they can log in, right? So let's add another line after the while loop. Let's say correct password entered. Exclamation mark. Right. And this is important. This needs to be outside of the while loop, because what happens if we put it inside of the while loop? If we put it inside, it's going to include this print line even in those instances when the user enters the incorrect password, right? So if we run this again, so if I enter the incorrect password, I don't see that correct password entered, right? Whereas if this was part of the while loop, if this was inside of this block of code for the while loop, we would be seeing that again and again, even with the incorrect password entered, right? Okay, so now let's put in the correct password and click enter. And there it is. There's our correct password entered feedback. So that's great feedback to have. Okay. Hopefully this was still very straightforward, even if you were not familiar with Scanner. Let's cover something slightly more complex. This time, let's create a text file and we'll write code to read from another separate text file. And as our code reads through that file line by line, it'll print each line to the console. Okay. So let's again comment out our previous code. I'm going to minimize the console. Okay, so let's create our print line. Let's create our text file. So I'm going to right-click, not on source, but actually on the project. I want the text file to be at the root of my project. So I'm going to right-click here, go to New, File, and let's call this essay.txt. And ChatGPT was nice enough to create this 100-word essay for us, if I can pull that up. So ChatGPT wrote this essay on why Java is such an awesome language. It's 7 lines. All right. So that's the essay. In our main method, here we'll include our code to actually read through that file. Okay, let's start off by specifying a string for the file name. So we'll say string file name equals essay.txt. Next, we're going to create a try-catch state block of code. So we'll say try, and if this is unfamiliar to you, that's okay. Try catch. Okay, so here's how a try catch works. A try catch attempts to run a set of code, and if an exception is thrown, if an error is thrown in that code, the catch block of code will be used to print out information about the error, and then the application will continue running. This is essential when you try to access other files or read from other files, because there's always a chance that the file doesn't exist or the file's corrupt. There's all kinds of potential issues that would cause problems with reading a file or working with a separate file that's outside of our application. Okay, so inside of the try, this is where we'll handle actually reading the content of the text file and then printing it to the console. All right, so we're going to use something called a buffered reader. Buffered reader is an object that will allow us to literally read from text files or text-based files. So we'll say buffered reader equals new buffered reader, and here we'll specify the file name. Here we'll say new file reader, and we'll say file name. Okay, I'm getting an error, but we'll fix that in a second. First, let's create a variable. So here's how the buffered reader works. The buffered reader reads through a text file line by line. And so as it reads through the file line by line, we want to create a separate variable to represent the current line that the buffered reader is on in that text file. So here we'll say string line equals br.readline. So now this variable line will contain the value, the text value of the current line that the buffered reader is on in the essay.txt file. All right, and then we'll say while line is not equal to null, print out the line and also move the line to the next line. So we'll say line equals br.readline. Okay, so here's what's happening. Our while loop contains this condition while line is not equal to null. What do we mean by this? So let's go back to the essay.txt file, but keep in mind that line represents the current line that the buffered reader is reading, right? So here's how this should work. As the buffered reader reads through this file line by line, that this value is going to be contained in the variable line, right? And in each iteration of our while loop, we want our loop to read this line, print it to our console, and then continue moving to the next line, right? And we want it to do we want this to be the case as long as line is not equal to null, right? So when does line become null? It becomes null once it gets to the end. So when we say line equals br.readline, by having this inside of the while loop, this is what's causing the line to actually continuously move through the text file. So at some point, when we get to the end, when we run that statement again, line equals br.readline, it's going to move to the line after this, but of course there is no line after that. So at that point, line will equal a null value or a non-existing value, right? So that's what will cause this to work. But we're still getting an error here. And that's because when you're, as I said earlier, when you're working with files that are outside of your application, there's always the chance that the file doesn't exist or the file is corrupted. So all kinds of things can go wrong. And those are known as input-output exceptions. So in this catch, over here, we need to specify what kind of exception could possibly happen given what we're attempting to do in this try block. So here, we're going to say input output exception, which is the data type for the error that we're handling, right? And then we'll say error. Error is the parameter that we're passing here, right? And here we'll just say print out whatever the error is, right? So if the file doesn't exist, or if the file, for whatever reason, if we can't read from that file, we'll get this print line here. Okay, let's try this out. There you go. So line by line, there is every line from our essay.txt file. So this is a real world use case of when you would use a while loop. So while loops are often used to read inputs either from a user or from another file. Okay, so when would you use a while loop? I've given you a couple of examples. When would you use a while loop instead of a for loop, right? So in the last lesson, we covered for loops. We talked about how you would use for loops if you know exactly how many times your loop needs to run, right? So for example, if you're actually printing numbers 1 through 10, you know how many times that loop should run. So that would be an example of when you would use a for loop. A while loop is used in the real world if you don't know how many times a loop should be running. So let's go back to our examples. We used the buffered reader to read through a text file, and we used a while loop to handle reading through those lines and then printing them to the console. We used a while loop here because there's no way in advance to actually know how many lines that text file is, because by nature, the buffered reader is going to read through that text file line by line until it gets to a null value, right? So when line is equal to null, that's how the buffered reader knows that it's at the end. So this is a situation where you would use a while loop because we don't know in advance how many times or how many iterations this while loop will need to run. Let's go back to our previous example. I'm going to uncomment this code out again. Let's place some space here. So in this example, again, we used a scanner to get input from a user to enter their password. A while loop is the correct loop to use in this case because there's no way of knowing how many times the user will need to attempt to enter their correct password before they actually get it correct, right? So this is another example of when you would use a while loop because we don't know how many times this loop will need to be run. Okay, so now you know how a while loop works, what it looks like, and when you would use it. So let's cover the next topic, which is a variation of the while loop known as a do while loop. A do while loop begins with the keyword do, followed by a set of curly braces, and between those curly braces, this is where you'll handle some task. At the end of the curly braces, you'll use the keyword while, and then this is where you'll place your condition. And here, let's again just say true. And here we'll say this, print line, this will print forever. Before we go through this, let's comment out the previous code so that doesn't clash with our print lines for the do while. Okay, let's come back here. Here's how the do while works. Whatever is in this do block of code is going to run at least once, no matter what. Remember, as opposed to in a while loop, I'm just going to briefly uncomment this out. A while loop checks a condition, and only if that condition is true, whatever's in the block of code is going to run. And it's going to continue running as long as this is true. Whereas the do while first performs a task, which means even if this condition is false, this block of code is still going to run at least once. Let's run this infinite loop just so you can see that running. I'm going to immediately stop it. And you can see that this got printed probably a few thousand times. Okay, now, but what happens if it's false, right? So we'll say, what if we say 1 equals 5? Obviously, 1 is not equal to 5. So this will not print forever. This will print once. Let's specify that here. So even if a condition is false, by using a do while, this will cause whatever task we want to run to be run at least once. There we go. So there's our print line for this will print once. Okay, what if we wanted to, for some reason, print the numbers 1 through 10? We could do that using a do while loop. So let's create a variable, we'll say int num3. Actually, I think we're at num4. Equals 1. What did I say? Print numbers 1 through 10, right? Okay, let's do that. So here we'll say print 1, or print num4, which is 1. And we'll say as long as it's the case that num4 is less than or equal to 10. Okay, let's run this. Ooh. We ended up with an infinite loop because, again, I forgot the essential step of updating this number so that eventually this condition will be false, right? So we initialize the number num4 to equal 1. And of course, if we never change that, then num4 is always going to be less than or equal to 10. So let's add our statement for incrementing the value of num4. And let's rerun this. There we go. Okay, so this time we actually get the print line of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, so this is how the do while works. Again, this is very simple. Let's give you a quick task. Let's see if you can create a do while loop that prints numbers. I'm going to throw you a curveball, slightly, a small curveball. Prints numbers 50 down to 30. All right, pause the video here and see if you can accomplish that task on your own. All right, hopefully that wasn't too challenging. Here, to solve this, we'll say int num5 equals 50. And here we'll have a do, and we'll have a print line that prints num5. And it'll continue to print and also decrease or decrement num5 minus minus, as long as it's the case that num5 is greater than or equal to 30. A common mistake that new developers make is that they forget to enter that semicolon at the end of the while statement in a do while. So this that semicolon at the end is essential. All right, let's comment out that previous code and run this again. And we should see a print line from numbers 50 down to 30. Cool, there we go. So now you know how a do while loop works, how it looks, and you also have a good understanding of while loops. Now let's go back to the question that I asked in the intro video. What loop would you use to perform this task? We want to cast a die. Is it dice or die? I'm not sure. We'll say cast a dice until you get a value of 6, right? So you're just going to keep throwing the dice until the value is 6, right? Would you use a for loop, a while loop, or a do while loop? If you answer do while, that's absolutely correct. Let's handle this task. We'll start by generating a random integer using random equals new random. And if you're not familiar with this, that's okay. Random is just used to generate random values. We'll also create an int dice. We won't create a value for it yet. And then we'll have our do while loop. So we'll say do dice equals random dot nextInt 6. This will give us a randomly generated integer from 0 up until 5. But we want numbers from 1 to 6. So instead of getting a random value from 0 to 5, to convert that into 1 to 6, we'll just say plus 1 at the end of this. So now every time this do block runs, this is going to generate a new random value from 1 to 6 and assign that value to the variable dice. And let's add a print line that says, oops, you rolled plus dice. So this will give us, tell us what value we actually rolled. All right, so, and we wanted this to continue running as long as it's the case that dice is not equal to 6. All right, let's comment out our previous code again and run this task. Cool, there you go. So the dice had to roll several times before we got a value of 6. Now, why do we need to use a do while loop instead of a while loop or a for loop? Because when you're checking what value the dice is or what value you have rolled, you have to roll the dice at least once, right? So that's why it makes sense to use a do while loop over here, because we're starting off with our do block of code actually handling the rolling of the dice and then giving us that value, and then we're checking whether that value is 6. And if it's not equal to 6, then we're going to roll that dice again, right? So this is why it makes sense to use a do while loop over here. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to click like and subscribe. And if you're interested in any of our courses, check out the link in the description for ethmatechacademy.com and take a look at our boot camps. I'll see you in the next video.